If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewing beer is often a lesson in patience. On brew day, it takes hours to make wort, which then gets fermented for days or weeks, and then conditioned or matured again for, again, days, weeks, or even months. I'll never forget a friend asking me, how long does it take to make beer? And I said, well, it takes about a month, but I can do it in as little as 2 weeks. And they said, wow, it takes so long. So, of course, I wanted to speed up the process. How fast can I brew beer? How fast can I get beer from grain to glass? But what do we sacrifice? Do we sacrifice quality in rushing to get the beer finished? Should we slow down a bit, or is it okay to go fast? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with John Palmer, a prolific author and speaker. He's the guy that wrote the first book I ever read about brewing. That's, of course, How to Brew, everything you need to know to make great beer. And he's here to talk about beer maturation. So there's actually a lot that happens post-attenuation. Attenuation is that part where the yeast converts the wort sugars into alcohol and CO2, which is one of the main things that we want in beer. But there's a whole lot that happens after attenuation, and John has been studying maturation for over a decade. He's a wealth of information with a ton of practical tips and advice. I wanted to know what happens if I try to rush through the brewing process, and John is the guy to ask. But first, I wanted to say another big thank you to our patrons. If you're not currently a patron, I encourage you, head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy and check out the monthly contribution levels. In addition to the feel-good vibes of helping to support the work we do here at Brewlosophy, you get access to a bunch of awesome rewards depending on the different pledge levels that you choose. You get access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. Guests like John Palmer, Jamil Zainashev, Vinny Chilurzo, and even Mr. Brewlosopher himself, Marshall Schott. And when you sign up, all of these prior sessions become immediately available to you on our private Patreon Facebook page. So please head over to patreon.com/Brewlosophy, find the information that you need, and become a patron of Brewlosophy. Thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet left a rating or review, I'd love for you to do so. I love hearing from y'all. It's a great source of feedback, and it helps others like you find the show. And again, without those reviews, we wouldn't have the Applying the Science series with Jordan, and the show wouldn't be what it is today. So thank you to everyone who has left a review. And if you haven't, please take a moment to help us out. Feedback this week is brought to you by Haas, who in collaboration with Yakima Valley's Brew Lot Farms developed Brew 1 hops, a variety that packs a wallop of tropical fruit character. As Hopped Up IPA continues to grow in popularity, many brewers are focusing on making theirs as juicy as possible, and Brew 1 does just that, imparting pungent notes of ripe pineapple and stone fruit while also contributing a very pleasing bitterness. A little tip, Brew 1 in conjunction with Sabro leads to a delectable pina colada flavored beer that's impossible to resist. Learn more about this tasty variety as well as the other innovative hop products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, listener Michael wrote in about episode 130 using gene editing for hop breeding. He says, hi, Cade, I really enjoyed the recent episode on the use of gene editing in hops. However, there's one aspect of this research that's almost always overlooked in these discussions: intellectual property, IP rights. As Dr. Willett described, things like CRISPR and other gene editing techniques have dramatically increased the speed at which researchers can identify and test the role of specific mutations in plants or other organisms, and they're free to use this technology in academic research. However, the second you start commercializing that product, whether it be a new hop variety, a pharmaceutical product, etc., they're all subject to extensive patent protections and are therefore subject to royalties and licensing fees. These IP protections include not just sequences that are incorporated into the final product, but also the methods you use to generate that product. For that reason, all of the initial R&D work is done using modern gene editing methods. The final product that reaches the market is almost always generated from scratch, with the known genes and mutations in mind, using standard breeding practices to avoid these potentially costly licensing fees. While this approach dramatically increases the time needed to bring a product to market, the time and effort is almost certainly worth it when there are millions of dollars at stake. I understand that this is not the most exciting aspect of crop development, but I felt it was important to mention as it has a dramatic impact on both how the research is done, but also how the final product that makes it onto our tables was actually made. Oh, man. Yeah, Michael, this is absolutely important to mention. And I think Chris did mention it during the episode, but even if he didn't, it's something that Jordan and I talked about in the Applying the Science episode. And yeah, it's super important to talk about this because using CRISPR to create commercial products isn't free. But like you said, if you use it in academic research to generate knowledge and understanding, and that's generally what most of what Chris was suggesting for using CRISPR to support hop breeding. If you use it to an academic researcher to generate knowledge and understanding, like general use cases, then yeah, you can use it to support hop breeding efforts. And that's important because, right now we're crossing all of these and we're crossing, different plants that we see that have disease resistance, but we may not be looking for the specific gene. I know some brewers like John Henning. John Henning's a geneticist, so he's done a lot of work trying to figure out which genes are where, but CRISPR can really tell us, right? So John can target some genes and say target gene resistance and say I think this is the gene, and then he can breed plants that have that gene and hope that the progeny is actually disease resistant. But then what Chris is suggesting is, hey, what if we knock out that gene in test plants in the lab, right? And when we determine and publish a paper that says, hey, yeah, this is the gene that's responsible for this particular disease resistance. Then somebody like John can take his genetic data and go, okay, this plant has the highest incidence of that gene. Let me breed this plant as a parent and see if I can breed out disease resistance. So it does speed up the process a little bit if you can do this research, which is really cool. And as we continue to learn more and more, it's a great thing. But absolutely, and I know you know this, Michael, but your email was about the IP, right? And so that's absolutely the case. If you use gene editing technology like CRISPR to create a new product, then yeah, you owe those patents. I mean, something like that is what Omega Yeast is doing, and I'm sure that they have some sort of relationship or agreement with the owners of the CRISPR patent to be able to do their yeast work. There will come a point, though, when CRISPR and Cas9 are no longer patented, which will be a huge day for science and innovation. And until then, like Michael mentioned, we won't be making CRISPR Cas9 hops without paying fees to the patent owners. All right, I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll be back in a few minutes with John Palmer talking about beer maturation. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science.
Early contests build momentum for 2024 contenders seeking the White House. C-SPAN offers unfiltered coverage of events leading into early primaries and caucuses. Get access to speeches and results with the free app, C-SPAN Now, or watch live on the C-SPAN networks.
Over my years of brewing, I've learned that I'm a very impatient brewer. If I can shorten the brew day by mashing for a shorter duration or boiling for 30 minutes instead of 60, or during fermentation, if I can ferment a lager, say at warm temperatures to shave some fermentation time, I'm here for it. My goal is to get the beer to the glass as fast as possible. And as soon as fermentation is done, rack to the keg, burst carb, and drink that beer within 24 hours. But as I get older, I wonder if that's really the best way to make great beer. Maybe beer should spend a little bit more time maturing. I don't know about that, but today my guest is the guy who wrote the book on brewing, John Palmer. So John, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Howdy. Glad to be here.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I've said it before on this show and to many other people that the first book I ever read on homebrewing was How to Brew by you, John Palmer. It was approachable. It was digestible, full of useful information. And of course, that's kind of the book that sparked my interest in diving into brewing science, right? I mean, you go through there's so much information in there in that book. Years later, I read the Water book through the Brewing Elements series, which of course you're also co-author on. And of course, my go-to recipe design book is Brewing Classic Styles, although I understand that's mostly Jamil's book. But again, you are a co-author on that. You've done a truly incredible amount, written a truly incredible amount of brewing literature. And I'm, of course, very glad to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It's really good to be here. I always enjoy talking about brewing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you've certainly done it a lot. And you're here to talk about beer maturation. Is this something you've been thinking about recently?
Yeah, it's a topic I kind of took a renewed interest in for the latest edition of the book, which came out in 2017. Because, yeah, it's, for me, the brewing processes have always fascinated me as an engineer.
Yeah.
What makes it tick? How does it work? Why does it work? Why do I need to do it that way instead of this way? That kind of thing. So, understanding fermentation, understanding lagering, all of that appealed to me. And so, I kept asking the questions until I felt I had a better understanding of it.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an interesting one too, right? Like I said on the intro, I've always been that kind of like impatient brewer, but man, as I get older and the longer I brew, I'm more like, is the beer ready yet? Yeah, sure. I can get a beer out in 7 days or 10 days or 14 days or whatever, if I really need to, but do I really need to, should it mature a little bit longer? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the question.
That's the question. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. But first, I want to do an intro of you. I mean, I already did a sort of a brief intro, but currently you are the publications director and editor-in-chief of the MBAA's Technical Quarterly. Of course, a prolific author and speaker, owner of Palmer Brewing Solutions, a brewing consulting services, and trained as a metallurgist in aerospace and medical devices. So you've got quite the background too. How did you, this is probably a long, maybe a question that'll have a long answer, but how did you become interested in studying brewing or diving into the details of brewing?
It's one of those things where back when I had a homebrew, friend of a friend had a homebrew when I was in college, and tasting that and thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. You can do this at home, because it was a pretty decent tasting beer. When I was at college in the 80s, I liked dark beers. I liked dark lagers that we had in northern Michigan. We called them Bock beers, but they were really more of an American dark lager. And Stroh's and Miller and Michelob and all those.
Yeah.
And when I moved to California after graduation, everything was Corona and Bud Dry and Bud Ice, and it's like, I want my dark beer. So that's what got me interested in pursuing home brewing, was trying to figure out how to make myself some dark beer.
Yeah. And then of course, like you dove off the deep end. You wrote a book about it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's because I made all the usual mistakes when I started out, and wrote a little document called How to Brew Your First Beer, because this was really pre-internet days when I was learning brewing and trying to figure it out. There were bulletin boards and news groups and so on where you discuss things, but not the websites that we have today, and certainly nothing like YouTube. So,
right.
Writing. Everybody said, you explain things well, you should write a book, and so I slowly took that ball and ran with it.
Yeah.
It took quite a while to get it done, but I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, well, of course, and it stood the test of time too. I mean, everybody that I talked to, commercial brewers, home brewers, everybody has a copy of How to Brew on their desk somewhere. And mine's annotated, and it's old, and it's crinkled, and it's been well used. So that's how you know it's a great book. And I also really appreciate the first chapter of the book, where you go through like, okay, I know a lot of you are impatient like me. And so here's how to brew a beer. It's the first chapter. Just do it, and then we'll talk about everything that you need to know later. So, of course, today we're going to chat about beer maturation. So we're going to start off kind of high level, talking about like what is maturation? Why might one want to mature a beer? What things might improve if you let a beer mature? Then we'll talk about some tips and tricks from John and learnings from your experience, all the years that you've been doing homebrewing, talking to people about it, and of course, writing books and speaking on those topics. So the first question we got to start with, what is beer maturation?
Well, maturation is really the completion of the fermentation process. So we are, I'm sure you can relate to this. We're very attuned to attenuation, getting from our original gravity down to our final gravity and thinking, okay, the beer's done. Well, it's half done, really, in my opinion, or maybe 2/3 done. Maturation is the finishing of the fermentation, where even once the yeast have eaten all the sugars and attenuations happen, there's still lots of fermentation byproducts floating around in the beer that the yeast can take up and resolve, produce better tasting flavors, as well as the yeast themselves, flocculating, settling out, clarification of the beer. All of these are broadly come under the umbrella of maturation. Two of the off flavors that we need to clean up, of course, are diacetyl and acetaldehyde. So that's the big, that's like the number one priority when it comes to maturation is, we've reached final gravity. Now we got to clean up diacetyl. Now we got to clean up acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde, of course, being that green apple or sliced pumpkin or latex kind of aroma that comes off of beer that, from the intermediate compound and the creation of alcohol.
Yeah, exactly. Those two big ones, right? Diacetyl and acetaldehyde. And I want to talk about those here in a few minutes, but I want to, that point that you made, that distinction between attenuation and maturation, that's so huge here, right? Because, like you said, you start with an original gravity and then it ferments down to a final gravity, and, there's no more alcohol that's going to be produced at that point. So a lot of people say, okay, done. The beer's done. Once I've reached my final gravity, I'm ready to take it off and keg it and drink it. But wow, there is so much more that goes on. Diacetyl, of course, being a big one. I think most people hopefully are doing some sort of a diacetyl rest or using enzyme, ALDC or something like that to actually clear up that diacetyl. But I want to talk about sort of like two, those things, those kind of compounds that are left over. But maybe that's one of the first questions then is, it's like, let's dive into what's going on during maturation. So you mentioned already that yeast are kind of done producing alcohol, not much alcohol going on, right?
Right. The production of alcohol comes from the digestion, using that guardedly, but the digestion of the malt sugars. They take in sugars, they produce intermediate compounds such as acetaldehyde, and that is a waste product to them. And so is the carbon dioxide that they kick off. Now, I kind of like to relate this to, working at the office, working in your cubicle. The boss comes in, slams down a huge pile of papers on your desk, and it's like, get this done by the end of the day. And so you start working and, crumbling up papers as you go. You got some coffee cups and food wrappers there on your desk, and those pile up as you power through this stuff. Lots of waste is produced when yeast ferment quickly.
Yeah.
And whereas if you had more time or a smaller volume of work, you would file things as you go, clean up as you go and put everything away neatly. And again, that's kind of how the yeast operate, where as they're fermenting, as they're taking in sugars and amino acids and so on, and creating energy and material to produce their daughter cells, because that's what it's all about. From the yeast point of view, they don't care about your beer. They're trying to make daughter cells.
That's right. Yeah.
So, if they're doing this at a good, normal pace, they can reap a little bit more energy by converting that acetaldehyde all the way down to alcohol and then excreting it. It's a more complete process that way. But if you've got them fermenting fast, and that usually means at a warmer temperature, then all these byproducts get excreted, and they'll worry about it later, if at all.
Yeah. Oh, I love that analogy of like the worker that's just trying to get through this huge stack of papers. Cause I can imagine too, you're like, sitting there at the desk, you're getting all hot and sweaty and you just got like all your trash all around you and you're just going, right? Trying to do everything. And that kind of can be what yeast is doing. So it's producing like trash. But I guess one question then I have, so a lot of brewers, and myself included at one time, think that, okay, once we've reached this terminal gravity, and like, as you mentioned, I think most people are looking at diacetyl at least, right? Just smelling the beer and making sure it doesn't taste buttery or something. Most brewers would say, or at least at one point or another say, okay, it's reached terminal gravity, past VDK, package and drink, right? But is that, would you say that the beer's ready to drink whenever you've passed VDK? You're done or no?
Yeah. In general, that is a valid benchmark. But again, going back to the office analogy, how completely did you pass VDK? How thorough were you in your processes to be sure that you've passed VDK? Diacetyl happens, the precursors to diacetyl happen anytime the yeast ferment. And especially, you've probably heard of hop creep these days.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Where you get additional fermentation happening, after the main fermentation, whether it's in a bright tank or in packaging, for that matter. A little bit of air and dry hopping combined allows the enzymes present in the wort or in the beer from the hops to break down just a little bit more fermentable sugar. That little bit of air that crept in at packaging, gives them just a little more incentive to process those sugars. And the next thing you know, you've got a diacetyl bomb in the package. Maturation is all about understanding these fermentation processes that lead to the byproducts and understanding, when that fermentation is really finished, because fermentation is not finished until maturation is finished.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, okay, we mentioned diacetyl, and then let's talk acetaldehyde then too. I think you mentioned sort of that acetaldehyde is that like intermediate step that the yeast does. It makes acetaldehyde to get energy, and then it takes that acetaldehyde and turns it into ethanol alcohol in order to get more energy or back into the cell, right?
Right.
And so what with acetaldehyde, is there still acetaldehyde around even if we've sort of like hit our terminal gravity, I guess? Is that?
Yeah. And that very much depends on the health of the yeast.
Oh, okay.
The yeast need zinc. It's a very important cofactor for the enzymatic reduction of acetaldehyde to ethanol. The yeast have to be active enough to be interested in taking up that that food source, because, it's, I don't know, it is a waste product. It's like, so I really want to eat that and get a little bit more energy. And if the yeast are sufficiently active, then the answer is yes. Whereas if the yeast are kind of old and tired by then, they're just like, oh, fuck it. I'm not going to do it.
Right.
So, and that's where pitching rate enters the picture, because one of our jobs as brewers is to understand the fermentation process, understand yeast management, and look at our original gravity, our pitching rate, and think, okay, I want to pitch enough yeast that I still have active, hungry yeast when all those sugars have been taken up. And if so, then they are going to start looking around for what else they can take up, and that'll be the diacetyl and acetaldehyde. So you have active, hungry yeast, you're interested in cleaning up these byproducts. And it's your job as a brewer to create the conditions where that happens. And once you've done that, now, you've completed maturation, and now you can let the beer go in, enter the clarification stage, the very, very final stage of maturation, and settle out, then, maybe do some chilling of the beer to settle the haze, and you've got a finished beer.
Yeah, right. And so are there other things other than, so diacetyl, acetaldehyde, those are kind of two big ones. Are there other things that are in there that also might need some time to mature out?
Not that I can name.
Okay.
Let me put it that way.
Sure.
I think there probably are, but as a metallurgist, my understanding of biology is thinner than I would like it to be.
No, that's okay. I'm on the same page as you. I'm training to be a chemist right now, or beer chemist. So I'm also not as great with the biology pieces. I leave those to the microbiologists. Yeah. But okay. So then there's kind of one of the points that we're doing here, right? And during maturation is to clean up some of these other off flavors. Again, hearkening back to your office, analogy. It's like, you've got like the burger wrapper and like the old, the Dr. Pepper or Coke that you had, sitting there. And maybe you've taken some time to like brush those into the trash can, but there's still crumbs and all kinds of things around there. So maturation is really taking the time, allowing the yeast to kind of like look around and say, okay, let's make sure we got all this cleaned up, make sure the desk is clean and it's ready to go.
Exactly.
So that when I come in tomorrow or whenever, it's nice and clean and it's all finished.
Right.
So
right.
This maturation then is, since diacetyl and acetaldehyde are generally off flavors, right? Diacetyl being buttery, acetaldehyde, like you said, that green apple or sliced pumpkin. Part of maturation is to improve beer flavor, right?
Yes, very much so.
And that's one of the things I hear oftentimes, and I think in talking to you before this show, this is a nice distinction. I hear people talk about mature beer flavor, right? And there's a lot of wiggle room here, right? Old ales, like Old English ales, are, quote, mature, but that's very different than like a crisp, clean lager that might have, mature beer flavor. Help us understand what makes a beer, quote, mature.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem of language, is we tend to use words in multiple situations. Mature flavor in an old ale is that, those are essentially staling reactions, oxidation reactions that have occurred, whether it's the esterification of fusel alcohols to create, some interesting esters, or oxidation of aldehydes and other compounds that create, some other fruity or melanoidin type characters in old ales. Those are spoken of as maturation, but that's really not what we're talking about here.
Right. That's more of staling, I guess, right? Like a staling thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Those are oxidative reactions that, in a stronger, more complex beer, adds some character. But in the case of lagers, Keller beer is essentially an unmatured lager. It's taken from the fermenter or the bright tank or cask at a younger age, and has some of these acetaldehyde characters that adds a little complexity to the beer. Some people appreciate the fruitier character of it, the little livelier character of it. But with time, in the bright tank or the whatever, those are going to go away and it'll become cleaner and crisper. And so, that's what maturation can be in some of the lager styles, some like Munich Helles, for example.
Yeah. So it is. It's that like cleaning up of those, like you said, acetaldehyde and those flavors, and it makes the beer taste, again, mature, right? I'm going to put that in air quotes because, like you said, we're limited sort of to our language here. It's mature because it's a beer that we know has spent that time during maturation to become a nice and pleasant and wonderful beer. Is so sort of while we're talking about lagers, is maturation like style dependent, or is it just kind of like a lager thing? Is it
No, it applies to all beers. And so, if we talk about different styles, then we're talking about slightly different maturation processes or maturation characters, let's say, because, different species, things are getting cleaned up.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? So, like you said, because I kind of think about like lagering as a maturation phase, right? And I guess actually, and I guess that's actually kind of a common thought, right? That's what lagering essentially was intended for a long time, was this maturation of beer.
Yeah. The history of fermentation and lagering is really quite fascinating, and I guess that's. Going back to your earlier question, that's what I've really been trying to wrap my head around the last 10 years is understanding, what we believed to be true then and what we believe to be true now and why is there a difference? And so, you go back to, 200 years ago, everything was open fermentation. All beer styles, open fermentation. And as that fermentation, as that attenuation phase wound down, the Kreuzen on top of the beer would settle. And now the beer is no longer protected like it was during that high Kreuzen attenuation phase. And so they would rack that unmature beer to a cask and allow it to mature away from oxygen because they figured that out, this doesn't taste good anymore. It tasted really good the other day. So oxygen exposure, in a cask is minimized. They, in storage, cool storage seemed to work well. In the UK, those became cask ales. In Germany, where they were storing the beer cooler and for a longer period of time with the lager yeasts, that started a different kind of maturation, oriented around those lager yeast strains. And various rules of thumb have been proposed over the centuries on, how long to lager or maturate the beer, depending on how strong it was or the style or the color and everything. But especially in the last 50 years, and then even in the last 20, we've gotten a much better understanding of yeast, their yeast life cycle, genome and so on. And it's fair to say that yeast work faster and more efficiently at warmer temperatures. And so this understanding came really from work done in the 1950s, Professor Ludwig Narcisse, among others, that, we came upon warm maturation or Narcisse fermentation, where we started doing warm diacetyl rests. And this allowed the yeast to stay more active and accomplish these maturation processes, diacetyl reduction, acetaldehyde reduction, more quickly and more completely. And then once those processes were done well, all that's left is simply to clarify the beer, and that can be accelerated by chilling.
Yeah.
So now they could chill the beer, down to 0, Celsius, and the yeast would flocculate and settle out. Haze would agglomerate and settle out, and clarification near 0 can typically occur within 10 days. So you could have a lager beer ready in 2 to 3 weeks instead of 2 to 3 months.
Yeah. Wow. And so that process that you're talking about, that Narcissus fermentation, that's kind of where what I might refer to as a traditional lagering process. But even though it's only maybe from the 1950s and 60s, that's that around 12 or 15 degrees Celsius, so 45 to 55 Fahrenheit. Letting it sit there until that attenuation is finished, and then slowly ramping it up a little bit, maybe say 5 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees Fahrenheit over time,
right,
and then crashing it back down, either slowly stepping it back down or crashing it quickly. That's that Narcissus fermentation that you're talking about.
Yes, essentially. The understanding that as that beer is attenuating, you can do some mid-temperature raises, to keep those yeast active, keep them, taking up those byproducts, or just holding it steady and then doing a 5-degree temperature rise at the end of fermentation, at the end of attenuation, I should say, to encourage that. Now, it's also got to be understood that there are many ways to skin this cat. So there are traditional lagering methods where, as that, the fermentation temperature during attenuation is held pretty constant, and then 1, 2, 3 degrees Plato, that's more like 2, I think. Anyway, before terminal, you start slowly cooling it, and you get the yeast trained to that slow cool, take it down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's 5 degrees C, and then hold for say 10 days. And that's kind of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees C. That's kind of the lower limit where the yeast are truly active, and but you train them to work the maturation processes, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, at that low temperature for a period of time, and then once you've passed your VDKs, as you say, you take it down further and allow the flocculation and haze settling to occur, and then the long cold maturation, or long cold lagering, which I think really is an artifact of when the beer is brewed and when it was intended to be served, because beer has a shelf life. And so, the colder you keep it, the longer that shelf life is.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And it's kind of one of those things, like it's a question of when is maturation done? Like you said, we know more about when the yeast is finished with this maturation process. We know temperature can impact this. We know, when diacetyl and acetaldehyde mainly are taken up, that the beer's kind of finished its maturation. And we can see in clarification, right? Whenever everything starts clearing out, we can see it. So we don't necessarily need to have, a 3-month or a 6-month lagering period, because we know more about the yeast now. That's really fascinating. And that kind of, okay, so this kind of brings me back to, at the front of How to Brew, you mentioned your 5 brewing priorities, which is sanitation, fermentation temperature, yeast management, the boil, and the recipe, as sort of like your 5 brewing priorities. So one quick question before we hit the break is, where does maturation fit into these priorities?
It comes before the boil and recipe. I mean, it's part of fermentation, which is really the main thing behind sanitation. So you got sanitation, you've got yeast management, fermentation control, and so on. And then you worry about the boil and recipe.
Okay. Well, I want to dig into those details, and it's perfect time for us to take a quick break. So we're going to do that, and then we'll be back talking about John's experiences with beer maturation and some tips and tricks for how to brew great beer. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry. You can turn $10 into $250. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/fan and use code FAN. That's code FAN at prizepicks.com/fan.
Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
Historically, beer was racked from the fermenter into a cask, where it would be stored in a cellar or cave until it was ready to be drunk. And in more modern times, beer is racked from the fermenter to a bright tank, where it awaits packaging. So, John, in How to Brew, you mentioned that the distinction between attenuation and maturation and the racking from a primary to a secondary fermenter comes directly from open fermentation systems, where the beer was cast away from oxygen to mature before serving. And I think you were talking about this just before we went to the break. Is this like this whole is this like a historical hangover, or is it still useful in today's brewing? It sounds like maybe we should be maturing our beers a little bit more.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to understand, because we can get very wrapped up with just the attenuation part. So it's important to understand that there are these 2 phases of fermentation, if you will. And where there's the rapid growth and the attenuation, and then this maturation phase where byproducts are cleaned up, and then the yeast settles, and then the haze settles, and the beer is actually ready. It's considered matured and in peak condition for a few months thereafter. And that does come in our nomenclature of primary and secondary do come from the fact that, it used to be all open fermentation. And then once that corrosion had settled, we needed to rack it to a more airtight container, get it away from the oxygen, and allow these maturation processes to occur, as well as priming or spunding, to get the carbonation that we wanted in the beer. And so, primary, secondary, modern home brewing or home brewing of 20, 30, 40 years ago kind of got this confused. Oh, yes, you have to rack to a secondary fermenter. A lot of that had to do with yeast health 30 years ago. Where yeast was not stored in a refrigerator. It was simply left laying on the shelf or on top of the can for a few months or years before you used it. So yeast health and vitality was not as strong then as it is now. Again, it's, our more modern understanding. And yeah, autolysis used to be a common problem with home brews and even some commercial brewers. But as our ingredients have proved, our understanding has improved, today's yeast health is very robust. And when I'm brewing lagers, home brewing lagers now, and dark lagers are still a real favorite of mine. I'm not racking to a secondary fermenter or a keg. I'm doing that whole fermentation in the single fermenter, whether it's a plastic bucket or a steel or stainless steel bucket. It's going through attenuation, maturation for a couple, 3 weeks, even a month, because I'm lazy and it's like, I don't feel like cleaning everything. And I'll get to it next weekend.
I hear that. I definitely hear that. I know exactly what you mean there.
Oh, do I really want to clean that keg? No.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, crap, I have to clean the keg before I can rack that over. Okay, I'll do it tomorrow.
Exactly. So, but today's yeast health is robust enough that that's not a problem. You can let that sit there on the yeast for a month or 6 weeks, and the risk of autolysis is pretty minimal. The yeast are, they're stable. So, we don't need to rack to a secondary fermenter, but you need the understanding of this secondary phase of fermentation. Maturation is still occurring, and you need to have good conditions for it to occur. And it helps to do that in the presence of yeast, because it is a yeast function, before you rack it to your serving keg.
And so you answered a couple of my questions there then. And one of them is this primary versus secondary fermenter distinction. And it sounds like, of course, that, it sounds like certainly you could use a secondary if you want to, if that's part of your practices. Yeah. It's not going to hurt, except maybe exposure to oxygen. But
you have to be careful about oxygen exposure.
Yeah, exactly. But, autolysis isn't as much of a concern these days because of better yeast health. And that was sort of the second question. Is I always get that question: how long should you let the beer sit on the yeast before you have to worry about off flavors coming, like autolysis or something? Yeah. And it sounds like, a month or so should be totally fine, as long as your yeast is healthy. And so this is one that you've mentioned several times. I haven't asked you a question about it, but you've mentioned several times the importance of yeast in this. So let's talk then about yeast. So how do you make sure that yeast have the tools that they need and the time they need to be able to complete this maturation process?
Yeah, that goes back to the top priorities, and yeast management is one of them. Fresh yeast, well aerated, or if you're using liquid yeast or repitching yeast from previous fermentation, aeration is critical. With modern, and I mean 2020 era. Dry yeast, active dry yeast, they are grown and dried in peak condition. And dry yeast really doesn't require aeration as such, like we talk about it in How to Brew and so on. It's the reason aeration is needed of yeast at the beginning of fermentation is because they use oxygen to help them synthesize fatty acids and amino acids that they can't immediately get from the wort. Those compounds are there, but yeasts have very small mouths, and they can only kind of take in one item at a time, and there's a certain priority list to what they're looking for at any one time, and it gets complicated from there. But suffice to say that if they're eating amino acid A, and the guys in the back of the cellar saying, "Hey, we need amino acid B, but you're busy. Okay, I'll use some oxygen and this fatty acid, and I'll synthesize the B while you're eating A, trying to make an analogy there.
Yeah.
And so that's why they need oxygen, because they need to synthesize these compounds. In modern active dry yeast, they are fed and dried with almost like a full complement of the amino acids, fatty acids they need. So much less synthesis is required. And that's why you don't need to worry about aeration quite as much with dry yeast. They still need oxygen, don't get me wrong. But they need less than if it was coming from a liquid yeast package or a repitched, harvested yeast from a previous fermentation that you had stored in the fridge. Kind of forget the original question, but
no, it was good. It's like, what conditions do yeast need in order to be able to do this? So it sounds like they need oxygen, and this actually is. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Lance Shaner from Omega Yeast. He did an article talking about this whole olive oil thing, right? If you can add olive oil to the fermentation, and he said, sure, there's part of the compound, part of the things that yeast need could be supplied from olive oil. That's true. But there's the other half of this, which is the sterols, and that can only come from oxygen. It's the only place it can come from where the yeast can synthesize this. And so oxygen is super important for yeast. But like you said, pitching maybe a fresh package of yeast, say from Omega or from Imperial, maybe doesn't need, a full, oxygenation complement, but active dry yeast especially, has everything that it needs. But if you're repitching, or if you're harvesting from prior batches and then putting them in, or, fermenting a beer on top of an already, present yeast cake, you may need to add some oxygen. Are there other nutrients? You mentioned zinc earlier. Are there other nutrients that yeast need in order to have healthy and active fermentations?
Yeah. Zinc is a notable one. Again, fresh commercial yeast packages are packaged with all the zinc that they need for two, maybe even 3 fermentations. But when you are if you're a commercial brewer and you're pitching, 10, 15 generations, then you need to add zinc to your yeast nutrients that you're pitching to help keep those yeast active. Zinc, again, being a cofactor in the reduction of acetaldehyde to ethanol. So that's why that's important. Are there other compounds that are equally needed? And and this is one reason why the hot break and the cold break, that trube, is important to yeast health. There have been many studies that showed that, like a fully turbid wort, coming from the mash tun, begets a, more vigorous fermentation than one that's been fully clarified. Now, the typical case where it's been partially clarified, the yeast have, more than enough nutrients in that partially clarified wort. But, if you go to either extreme, then there's a big difference.
Sure. Yeah. So there are those nutrients that are present in trube, right? That hot break, cold break is actually giving into the fermentation. But like you mentioned, right, you don't need to just stir it all up and dump everything into the fermenter. There's a happy medium somewhere. And I think that's been pretty consistent with our experiments here at Brewlosophy, that Marshall's done and that other contributors have done. It's kind of like, you need some, but not like, I still think of the one beer that he did, which was basically just take all the trube and dump it in the fermenter. It did ferment quickly, but there were some other issues there too.
And that's a really good point. We need to understand that, again, the yeast don't care about their beer. They care about reproduction. More trube, better reproduction. Yay. But in terms of beer quality, a little less reproduction would probably be good, from our point of view as brewers. So that's why we're controlling our fermentations. And this is why we talk about starting fermentations a couple degrees cooler, when you pitch, than the actual fermentation temperature. You want to kind of start out slow, don't get them going, don't start out warm and then try cooling them down. Start a little bit cool and let them ease into that fermentation. They produce less byproducts that way. And another point I wanted to bring up was when yeast reproduce with their daughter cells, they are sharing their vacuole, which is essentially a storage closet of nutrients that they have within the cell. They're sharing that vacuole with the daughter cell. So they will continue reproducing until they get down to minimum stores. And that's when they stop reproducing. We talk about, they need to synthesize sterols for reproduction in their cell wall. And when those are used up, they stop reproducing. Well, yeah, those sterols and other lipids are stored in the vacuole, which is shared with the daughter cell. So yeast will typically go through 2, 3, maybe in some cases 4 daughter cells before they run out of nutrients. And that's understanding that limitation helps us understand pitching rate, yeast nutrients, including aeration and fermentation temperature, all these things that go into, is this not only a vigorous fermentation, but is it a good fermentation for the quality of the beer that we want?
Yeah, right. Because you mentioned you need to have these yeast that are healthy, viable yeast that are able to look around and clean up the beer at the end.
Exactly.
We don't want, sick yeast, the yeast that's had to just struggle for its life, and then look around and go no, I'm not picking up that trash. I'm not doing it. I'm done. And so you mentioned a couple of other things there that I wanted to ask about real quick. And one of those was pitch rate, right? Yeast and pitch rate. How important is pitch rate to maturation, pitching the appropriate amount of yeast?
Yeah, again, pitch rate is trying to gauge relative to the original gravity of the beer when that attenuation is going to finish. When those sugars run out, you should have enough yeast that are still, first, second generation, maybe third generation, still have enough activity that, it's oh crap, the sugars are gone. I'm going to eat this acetaldehyde. Get that, and that allows me to produce yet another daughter cell, again, because that's what their goal is. You're trying to balance pitching rate versus original gravity, and to facilitate conditions where the beer maturates efficiently.
Any recommendation on hitting a right pitch rate, on how to figure out where and what amount is appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about the 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, or 1 billion cells per liter per degree Plato. And that's a good rule of thumb. That's a good starting point. For ales, for healthy ale yeast coming from, a fresh packet, a 0.5 billion per liter per degree Plato is sufficient for most ale fermentations. When it comes to a lager fermentation, something double that, 1 million or 1.5 million per degree Plato, so on. And I said 0.75 is probably a more typical pitching rate, 0.75 billion per liter per degree Plato. For ales, 1.5 billion per liter per degree Plato for typical lagers.
Yeah.
That gives you a little bit of extra yeast to cover any eventualities. Over pitching is less of a problem than under pitching can be.
Okay. Yeah. Under pitching may be stressing the yeast out or causing the
exactly.
yeast to, yeah, making it work too hard. Or I guess maybe that's the thing, right? This idea of splitting the vacuole, that sort of resonates with me in a way, right? If you've underpitched the yeast, it's going to split this vacuole until it's got, there's just not enough yeast that's able to finish everything out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I've run into, in judging this past year, GABF and so on, I've run into situations where I'm picking up more sulfur in pale ales than I would normally get. And I think that often may be a case of overpitching of yeasts such as US-05, where, too much yeast is being pitched just because instead of just using a partial brick, they'll throw the whole brick in. And that can create yeast stress because suddenly now you have all of these yeast looking for amino acids and nutrients from the wort. You come up with an abundance of group A amino acids and no immediate access to group B. They synthesize it and produce sulfur compounds as a result. So, yeah, fermentation can get really complicated when you start looking at all these different biological paths. But again, this is why, as brewers, we have these guidelines on pitching rate to help us kind of, split the middle in these and have a better beer as a result.
Yeah, and to get it right where we need it. And again, we're focusing heavily on maturation, right? Not talking as much about attenuation, but what's happening during an attenuation affects what happens during maturation, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, okay, then a next question then, or sort of moving along the process, how do you know then when the beer is done maturing?
Well, taste, taking samples, and that's what, professional brewers do. They have, their QA go around and sample from the Zwickel. But as a home brewer, I think time, just giving that beer adequate time. And even my ale fermentations, again, I'm, as opposed to trying to do everything fast and getting over with, I'm lazy enough where, that beer has been in the fermenter at fermentation, primary fermentation temp for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. My maturation was done probably a week ago, but I'm just not getting around to it.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so, just give it effective time. Kind of my rule of thumb for maturation time is at least as much time after attenuation as it had before. So if the attenuation phase, that rapid bubbling in the airlock, if that lasted 3 days, then give it at least 3 days after that to allow the yeast time to clean up compounds. If you're taking 2 weeks for an ale fermentation, that's probably sufficient time.
Okay. Yeah. 2 weeks for an ale fermentation, kind of like a general rule of thumb that's sufficient time to mature. But of course, you can let it go a little longer if you need to or want to, or if you're like us, if you're like me and John, and just not getting around to racking it into a keg yet. What about chemical additives that might speed things along, like ALDC or like copper to get rid of sulfur?
ALDC is a very nifty product. It's an enzyme that essentially shortcuts from the acetohydroxy acid precursor directly to the acetoin end product that the yeast would otherwise accomplish. Let me talk a little bit about diacetyl production. So when the yeast are taking in amino acids and during the attenuation phase, they're taking in amino acids, synthesizing specific aminos that they need, and in doing so, they produce these fragments of the amino acid, which are acetohydroxy acids. And these acetohydroxy acids are waste products. The yeast will not take that up. It is something they have shit out of the cell.
Yeah.
And so you have these acetohydroxy acids floating around. They chemically react. They oxidize chemically. And when they do so, they turn into diacetyl. Mm-hmm. Diacetyl is a compound that the yeast can take up. So one problem with not understanding fermentation for new brewers is that they will chill the batch too soon. They say, okay, I've hit terminal gravity. I'm going to start lowering the temperature and get this thing, puppy ready for packaging. Yeah. Well, in doing so, they retard that chemical reaction from occurring that changes the acetohydroxy to diacetyl. And so all this acetohydroxy is hanging around, gets packaged, and then that package may sit warm on the store shelf or in your closet or basement, and then it converts to diacetyl. Mm-hmm. And then there's no more yeast around to take it up. So you have diacetyl in your beer.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's essentially what you need. You need the yeast to be able to take it up. And that's where like ALDC could come in. What you're saying is the yeast takes up the diacetyl and then turns it into acetone, which acetone is flavorless or flavor neutral.
Right. Yeah. Much less flavorful than diacetyl.
There we go.
Yeah. And so ALDC enzyme essentially does that work for the yeast cell. Converts the acetohydroxy directly to acetone.
Yeah. Directly to acetone. So it skips the diacetyl phase, so the diacetyl won't be floating around in your beer. Okay, yeah, and that's a good. So chemical additives then can speed up maturation.
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. And then, I mean, there's all kinds of chemical additives out there. I mean, I'd encourage people, if you're interested in those, go look them up and see what they do to help you speed up that maturation process. But then the very last part of maturation, right, is what you talked about was clarification. And so this is one that we get questions about it all the time at Brewlosophy. It's like, what are, finings like gelatin or biofine or something? How is that impacting maturation? Is that pulling away, good hoppy, whatever beer flavor compounds? Is it speeding things up? How is that impacting maturation, finings?
Yeah, there's essentially two classes of finings. One group is attracted to proteins. The other group is attracted to polyphenols. Beer haze is a protein polyphenol complex. So you can use biofine or PVP to attach to the polyphenol part of the equation, and you essentially drop haze, more rapidly, take it out of solution. Gelatin, isinglass, they attach to the yeast. They encourage yeast flocculation. And they help clear the beer that way.
I see. Yeah.
Now, calcium is a very important cofactor for yeast flocculation. And again, we can get into water adjustment here, but essentially you need, good calcium levels in your beer to promote a clear beer, high clarity. The yeast, depending on strain and calcium level, will naturally flock together, settle out. Your haze, your protein polyphenol complexes, those will come together, oxidize, agglomerate, and settle with time. And cold temperatures promote both yeast settling and haze settling. So that's why a lagered beer is a clearer beer than, say, the Keller beer.
Yeah. So this maturation encompasses all of these things, right? Maturation encompasses the flavor, adjustments from diacetyl and acetaldehyde being cleaned up. I mean, it also makes a nice, crisp, clean beer, assuming that's what you're going for, right? If you're brewing a hazy IPA, then, the clarification step might not be as important.
Right.
And okay, and then so I think you just answered this next question, or at least have a good answer for it when you talked about calcium and water chemistry. But one of the, again, sort of harking back to your 5 priorities, one of them was recipe design. And so I wanted to ask, like, what are some recipe design either implications or tips can you do whenever you're thinking about making sure that the beer has what it needs during that maturation phase? And it sounds like at least calcium and water chemistry is important for this part.
Yes. Yeah. because you're setting up the cofactors for these clarification processes at that point. Other aspects of recipe design that can affect your maturation time or effectiveness. Use of adjuncts can be use of specialty malts. With any beer style, you're often trying to achieve a certain appearance and flavor profile, of course. And so with specialty malts such as caramel malts, you have a higher oxidation and staling potential with some caramel malts, the C60, 40 to 60, 80, that kind of group, a little bit higher oxidation potential in those than the others. And so you've got to be aware that those beers don't have quite the length of shelf life that Helles would, with less specialty malts. Wow, there's just all kinds of tangents I could go off on. Adjuncts, the use of adjuncts, very interesting topic in itself. American lager, Budweiser, Miller, Coors, some of the highest shelf life of beer in the world, and it was designed that way. That was part of the popularity of it. 100 years ago was the fact that American lager had better shelf stability than any other beer in the world, including those made in Germany at the time. And part of that reason for that is we were using, a high proportion of adjuncts, rice and corn, that had less amino acids. And one of the factors for beer staling is leftover amino acids after fermentation. Mm-hmm. Those amino acids can form Strecker aldehydes, where they essentially oxidize and turn into these aldehydes that cause off flavors. And, the stale taste, the cardboard, the papery, and so on that you get, the toffee flavor from caramel malts, all those are the result of Strecker aldehydes. And so, when it comes to recipe design, it's not so much how it affects maturation, but really how maturation and ingredients can affect shelf life for that style.
Yeah. I think that makes sense, right? So using adjuncts or like watching your specialty malts, paying attention to your water chemistry, these things are going to impact that maturation phase and thus the shelf stability of your beer.
Yeah. It's all wrapped together. And it's kind of like optimizing your car, in that regard. Understanding how all the different systems, work together to deliver performance, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that so true, right? Everything is all interrelated in beer. I mean, the more and more that I study beer and dive into brewing science, I'm just so amazed at how interrelated everything is, right? All of it plays. Water chemistry plays a role in it. The malt, the hops, the yeast, the time, the temperature, the process, the equipment, all of this stuff plays a role. I mean, that's why people are like, you were able to write books about it.
Because I'm still fascinated with it today. I had a great conversation with Dan Carey just 2 weeks ago at the MBA conference. Uh-huh. Talking about his experiences, in amino acids and staling and aldehydes and so on. Fascinating.
Yeah. Dan Carey, of course, from New Glarus Brewing Company up in Wisconsin. Yeah. Okay. Well, I always ask this of my guests towards the end of the show. I mean, we talked a lot about beer maturation today, but if there's one thing that you want brewers to take away from today's episode, what would it be?
Faster is not better.
Yeah, short and simple. Faster is not better. So I think that's one that I'm going to take to heart, especially because I have been very impatient over my brewing career. And I agree, faster is not necessarily better. I like it. Well, is there anything else, John, that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to today?
No, I think we covered quite a bit. So yeah.
Well, and of course you brought up water chemistry and calcium, and that's certainly a tangent that I want to take, some time to talk about. I'd love to have you back talking about water, talking about tips and tricks and things there. So, but again, thank you so much for joining me today in the Brew Lab to talk about beer maturation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, listeners, in the show notes, you will find a link to How to Brew, Everything You Need to Know to Brew Great Beer Every Time by John Palmer. And next week, of course, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.